Hello and welcome to our panel where we're going to be looking at embracing change, reassessment, recovery and resilience as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But to know where we're going, it's important to understand where we have been. We've heard from Canso recently that the return of passengers continues to be slow. The risk and, in fact, the happening of the second wave has resulted in a dampening of short-term forecasts with wide regional variations in the recovery. Analysts are suggesting that without further relaxing of the travel restrictions or a testing regime that will enable travel, additional recovery will be a journey made in hope rather than expectation. But from a region boasting the busiest international airport in the world and a veritable crossroads for air corridors from east to west and north to south, the skies are frighteningly quieter than many of us can remember. At the heart of this is the UAE, which has continued operations throughout COVID-19 and has successfully restarted its global connectivity. But at what price to its air navigation providers and the air traffic systems? What do the UAE's airlines hope for the return to normal service? And how do we expect the future to happen? Well, we've got a great panel with us to share some of those ideas. We have Mohamed AlZaabi, the Acting ANS Quality and Safety Manager for the GCAA, the UAE's regulator. Hi, Mohamed. We have
Hello.
Mike Dolbey, the Vice President for Air Traffic Services at Dubai Air Navigation's DANS. And finally, we have Geoff, the VP for Flight Operations Support Services and Air Traffic Management from Emirates Airline. Welcome, gentlemen. So,
Hello.
Mohamed, let me start with you. Continuing operations throughout COVID-19 was a major global challenge. We talk a lot about collaboration, but how do you think collaboration actually helped ease those last-minute disruptions in the UAE?
Well, Alan, the pandemic has actually changed the situation around the world in air traffic movements. Well, the air traffic has gone around down to almost 80% comparing to the last years. The changes in the last minute has pushed or kicked the entities and the organization to look and reshape the future of aviation and look forward for collaboration with other entities and sharing the information in order to maintain an ongoing operation for the aviation industry.
And Mike, how do you see that the challenge? How do you see collaboration help ease the disruptions?
Alan, I think the disruptions were largely impacted the airports and the airlines more so than they did ATC from an operations perspective. Where we were really disrupted, or where there were last-minute disruptions, were with ensuring we had service provision, where there were our staff members having come into contact with positive COVID cases or being tested positive themselves. And that would impact a large swath of controllers. If one person were to be tested positive, might impact 25 or 20% of the controlling staff at one time. And so we needed to collaborate very closely with the Dubai health authorities, with the aeromedical authority within the regulator, the General Civil Aviation Authority. That's where our collaboration was in ensuring that we didn't disrupt the provision of service to a large extent.
Geoff, you've got a comment to make on this as well, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, very much so. I think, it's when it first happened, we were forced into a reaction. And from the airline perspective, it basically meant most of us stopped flying. But there was an obvious need to then sort of, when we need to start supporting the supply chains and whatnot, there was a lot of unknowns. So we had aircraft parked all around the world. We had pilots who hadn't flown for a while. We had aircraft that hadn't flown for a while. There was a huge amount of dialogue between regulators, the various other entities, the manufacturers, Airports, GHAs, they've had staff furloughed everywhere. What is actually available? You know, where can we go? What is available? What are the constraints, and how do we manage it? And then, as Mike says, you know, we had units all over the world that were going down to ATC 0 and no capacity. How do we manage that? It was really important in those first 4 to 6 weeks that everybody started engaging, because if we didn't engage, there were a huge amount of unknowns, and the unknowns, it creates risk. And it's been really good. Really, one of the real positives that's come out of this is the amount of engagement between the various entities.
Because of course that is a challenge, isn't it? I mean, we know that the airlines, as you say, that stopped flying. We know that the crew pilots were laid off. However, even if you've got 4 or 5 doing repatriation flights or carrying vital freight, you still need those air corridors to be open, and you still need air navigation services and air traffic management to be operating. So Mike and Mohamed, doesn't that put you in an incredibly difficult position that you might have to keep on an entire workforce when they're only doing half an hour of what they would normally do in, you know, in a normal day, having to do that through their week? How did you manage to keep going, or were you just burning up cash?
From a cash perspective, there wasn't much we could do, especially in the early days. We didn't know whether this was going to last 2 months, 3 months, 18 months. You know, it could have, for all we knew, towards the end of March, that by the end of Easter, as it was lauded in some parts of the world, that by Easter we would be back to normal. So we didn't know how long this would be, but it was really, really important to us to be able to continue to provide service. If we weren't getting much international traffic, we were still controlling traffic for the military. We were still providing a service for repatriation. We were still providing a service to aircraft carrying cargo. So, you know, we had to be resilient. We had to have staff that were on standby, that if there was a difficulty in having enough staff to provide that necessary service, that we had a contingency in place.
So it needed cooperation from your staff, your workforce as well, doesn't it, to do that? And was that managed okay? I mean, did you have to lay people off and now have to train them to come back again?
Well, we definitely have been. We implemented what we call transition training, where our 2 busiest units, the controllers, have all been through the simulator, where they practice traffic levels that they were experienced pre-COVID-19. Practicing procedures that were being utilized pre-COVID-19, aircraft performance. For example, the supers were down to, I think, 1%, or even they were 0 for a while, and then the last 2 or 3 months they've been between 1 and 2% of the traffic. Previously, before COVID-19, they were 15% of the traffic. So we needed controllers to be practicing working with the different performances of the different aircraft that they hadn't been doing for a while. So we did a session of that in July. We're busy with another one now, and we will do a 3rd session in February, just to make sure that the controllers are not caught off guard, that we protect them, and that they're able to provide the service at very short notice.
Mohamed, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I totally agree with the approach that Mike was referring to. That's the same thing that was carried also at GCA at Sheikh Zayed Navigation Center, that covering the area control center of the United Arab Emirates. We had a big drop of air traffic movement, but at the same time, certain elements or certain things that has restricted the number of staff to be able to approach work. We had to change or reallocate the number of sectors, combining sectors, change the workflow of the traffic that comes into the UAE in and out. Plus, at the same time, we had to maintain as what Mike was referring, maintain the competency of the controllers to be able to make sure if when the traffic comes back to normal, we need to get those controllers to meet the standards that the service are delivered to the airlines, and they don't get caught on guard. We had to utilize the simulator and maintain emergency scenarios, maintain the traffic flow, the complexity and the density of the traffic to make sure that the controllers are meeting the minimum standards that they need to obtain in order to maintain the required flow of the traffic into the UAE.
Okay, thank you. Geoff, can I come to you now? Continuing operations throughout COVID-19, a major global challenge, you know, as we know, but the lower demand has led to the relaxation of many operational constraints. What and how should these be managed as the demand starts to grow again?
Oh, first of all, we're incredibly thankful for the units that have done so, and most of the world has accommodated this. Direct routings, reduce the flow measures, across the North Atlantics, reduce some of the technical requirements. We're really thankful because the less constraints meant the more efficient we could operate, what little we're operating. What it has shown though is that we can sustain operations and we're starting to grow in certain places. So we had constraints in place previously based on assumptions and presumptions of where we were. As we come back, now's the time to challenge those and understand what is it we actually need to manage the traffic of the future. It's not going to be a massive growth. We're not going to have a sudden explosion. And in January, once the emergency approvals are in place, in January, we're going to go back to where we were last year. Not going to happen. What we are going to see is that slow incremental growth again. There will be steps as things happen. There will be step recoveries, but that's normal in any operation. But just because it was there before doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be there now. Now's the opportunity to have a real look at what the value add for some of these procedures are. Was the constraint really necessary in the first place? Could we adapt that constraint or reduce it? You know, we want to make sure that what we end up with is as efficient as possible. So I think it's a challenge for everybody to make sure and try and challenge our convention, challenge where we were. What do we need for the future to sustain a really efficient and viable air operation?
Okay. Mohamed, can we just talk about operational roadblocks then? There were a number of them that had to be faced. And how do you see those being removed to help overcome future logistical challenges?
Well, the outbreak of the COVID-19 has a severe impact around the globe. Especially also the aviation sector has a big impact where it has stopped so many things along the way. Staff working at Aerospace facilities at airports and has certain limitations reaching to work, especially during lockdown. People were away on leave and couldn't come back. Other blocks entering, for example, into the Emirates of Abu Dhabi. For example, staff are working in the Emirates of Abu Dhabi, but actually living in Dubai. Those kind of blocks actually has restricted the number of staff even getting to work. Controllers and other personnel at many air traffic facilities has even become infected with the novel virus, potentially leaving some facilities with less than their normal staffing at certain times. At the same time, however, a significant reduction in the number of flights has lessened the demand of air traffic control services. Other roadblocks that faced ANSPs as well, the limitation of carrying maintenance checks sites outside the facility itself. To assure the radar coverage, the radar facility, and going and checking that site itself, making sure it's maintained properly and it's up to has the required services and connectivity. Also, to keep the training of ATC personnel in live operation was very, very limited to maintain especially the social distancing. So there is so many things that also has counted into the roadblocks. For example, the staff availability, testing and tracing cases, planning positive cases, and what should be actually done. The process that dealt, for example, the staff who are working in the offices, the work from home against the work that can be conducted at home, rostering versus the traffic movements. So there's so many elements that can be looked into, and we had to alter the way that the operation are carried in order to make sure that it's running smoothly. But looking into this roadblocks, we shouldn't be also limiting our view into just focusing, for example, on this the pandemic. Let's say now we have seen the health pandemic. What about, for example, are we ready, for example, for the next pandemic? What some people would refer to it as the electronic pandemic. Now everybody is doing everything at home. So everything, we are connected to the electronics, internet, this and that. So that preparation has to be there. We need to come up with the contingency planning that has to happen and to be ready for it, and has to align those points to be certain scenarios, getting this and start testing it, capture the gaps, see how can we improve it, scenarios that nobody would have thought of before.
And that's, I want to pick up on the point that Geoff made about we don't have to do what we were doing before. You know, there's one thing that doesn't change, and that's change itself. We need to keep changing, but it could be that there are lessons that we've learned. There could be operational practices that happened during the pandemic that we ought to say, look, since 1940, we've been putting these barriers in the way. Perhaps we need to get rid of them now. Do you think there will be an appetite for almost rethinking the way that we operate now and remove some of those operational constraints, you know, that Geoff's talking about? Let's do it differently.
Well, the way I thought of it, for example, some of the examples that the flexibility, let's say, talking about the airspace, the flexibility of use of the airspace, something that we haven't done it. We've tried it in a different way before, but for example, now, due to the big reduction of traffic flying in the airspace, we could have also utilized the direct routing, the free routing of the flights throughout the airspace to make the support and that required by other airline operators as well. So certain things can be adjusted in order to smoothen and adapt to the future needs.
And Mike, what do you think? Do you think, you know, you guys are ready to change the way the operational constraints have been in order to make it a braver new world?
Yeah, I don't think in the short term there's going to be any significant change to the way we do business. It does give us an opportunity, though, to look at perhaps prioritizing different things slightly differently. For example, we could start, or we could prioritize more highly things like continuous descents, continuous climb outs. I think that in a longer term, that UAS and UTM might be prioritized worldwide because of what's transpired now in COVID-19. But I also think that from an operational service provision perspective, the last roadblock we want is one that's put in there by air traffic control and its ability to provide the service. We need to be agile. We need to be able to ramp up the service provision at short notice if required. It would be a travesty if everyone else was ready, the demand was there, but air traffic control wasn't in a place to provide at least the level of service we were doing pre-COVID-19.
So Geoff, is that encouragingly good news for you then, that that we may actually be removing some of those constraints?
Yeah, very much so. You know, and I think it's, it's all about the value. One of the things that we've been banging on about from throughout this COVID industry is if you're going to introduce a constraint for travel at the moment, make it risk-based, make it justifiable. When we reintroduce these things, we've got to go within the same process. Why are we doing it? What's the benefit, the core benefit to the industry? Some things are invisible to the operator. Some things are invisible to the ANSP. Some things are invisible to the airport. We get that. But overall, the entire ecosystem needs to live in harmony together, and we're all there to support one thing, and fundamentally that's air travel. And that's what we need to be focused on.
So let me just ask you about that. I mean, what's the relationship like pre-COVID, and where do you hope it to go post-COVID, between the airlines, the airports, and the air navigation services? I mean, are you a closely friendly club, or are you real competitors fighting your own corners and trying to get one over the other?
No, I think we are cohesive. We've all got our own priorities. At some times, those priorities come up against each other. I don't apologise for that. I think that's actually good. We're there to challenge each other. We're there to challenge Mike and Mohamed and the guys to sit there and deliver a better service. They're there to challenge us to on-time performance. Are you being as efficient? You do as you're told. Those sort of things. And the airports are the same. If we're not there challenging each other, we don't progress. We shouldn't be sitting there in isolation, coming up with a plan that's best for the industry, unless you're actually talking to the industry about it. In the UAE, we've got a very good working relationship with the other stakeholders. We talk on a regular basis. I think it's been a bit slow in recent time for the obvious constraints, but we have a regular dialogue. If necessary, we can pick up the phone or send an email, and we know we're going to get an honest response. Right throughout, as with the unknowns, I've been sending a look to Mike's team and Mohamed's team of what our schedule's looking like for the next 6 to 8 weeks, so they can do their planning. It's those basic things that we can build up from. Generally speaking, it's very good. Doesn't mean it can't get better, but I think this has demonstrated how important it is that we continue to improve those relationships.
I can see Mike.
I agree 100%. Sorry, Alan. I agree 100% with Geoff. We need to continue to challenge each other, which allows us to challenge ourselves. Geoff was talking about the information that he shares with us on a regular basis vis-a-vis the expected scheduling over the next 4 to 8 weeks. We interact on a wider industry level throughout the country with NASAC that Mohamed AlZaabi will know about. We interact a little bit more closely within our immediate stakeholder environment very regularly. It's not all hugs and kisses, but I think we do okay. Again, as Geoff says, there's definitely room for improvement.
Mohamed, I saw you nodding. It's not all hugs and kisses. I mean, do you hate that moment when the airline's coming in to see you, or or somebody else? What do you think?
Well, for me, it's the connectivity between the airlines and the ANSPs. It plays a really vital role, as we mentioned in the beginning. The collaboration part, as we will have the better services and better, for example, that what also Geoff referred to, and we have better challenges. Actually, they challenge us, we challenge them back. But at the end, those challenges will bring up the points or the elements that no one has, for example, thought of, and we try to overcome those challenges in a most convenient way.
Geoff, I'll just finish on this particular point. Though, the United Arab Emirates, we're united in a lot of the ways we do things, but Emirates, of course, is a global airline. You're reaching so much of the world. What sort of relationship do you have then with the counterparts in ANS across the globe? I mean, are you involved, and will you get more involved in that, do you think, post-pandemic?
To be honest, we've worked very hard at trying to establish links across our network. When we bring up a new station, we try and establish links with that airport, with that ANSP, at least so we've got a contact. One of the things we say to people when we go out, doesn't matter where it is in the world, is look, we recognize that, you know, in your environment, we might be the problem just because we don't know necessarily what you're expecting. So you come to us, we can help resolve that problem if we know that we're part of that issue. So we do have those relationships. We also work very closely with IATA and the various regional coordinating groups around the world. We're a member of every one in the globe. And the point is to actually engage on a regular basis. It's sort of an age-old expression of put up or shut up. You know, from our perspective, we want to be out there engaging people. We'd rather work collaboratively with people rather than sort of pushing from a distance and just criticizing. You know, one is we want to push for change, but we want to push constructively. So we want to help work together for the solution, not just saying, here's a problem here, you guys need to solve it. Here's a problem here, we want to work together and say, how do we actually resolve that? What's the best solution? We'll give you some examples of the flight planning point of view. You come back and tell us what you may or may not be able to do from a routing point of view. Let's work together on this. And so we try to make those relationships around our network.
Okay, so what are the challenges that remain now that could potentially impact the recovery?
I think it's anything that's going to actually challenge that traffic growth. One thing the pandemic has demonstrated really, really clearly is how intrinsically we are linked to that one thing. And I keep saying it's about air travel, but it is about air travel. It doesn't matter whether we're carrying packs or cargo. Our revenue is based on that. If we don't have the revenue, we stop flying. If we stop flying, the ANSPs suffer because they don't have the traffic. So it's their revenue goes down. The airports, all the subsets of those groups, the GHAs, the other contractors supporting the airport, all the people living around those airports, those communities, everybody's suffering. The hospitality industries, you know, all the freight forwarders, everything is linked, and it all comes back to the ability to service commodity, be it people or freight, from point to point. As we go back to the recovery, we know everybody's been hurting. We really have to be looking very clearly at the governments in particular to make sure that we can sustain this. A lot of the ANSPs in particular are still fundamentally state-owned enterprises or government funded. If they're not stepping into the breach and helping that, potentially here's these ANSPs that have lost revenue that need to recover that revenue. They've got a fixed workforce that they have to pay for. They've got very expensive infrastructure that they have to pay for. If they suddenly start putting their prices up, that's going to come back and actually implicate the ability for us to operate efficiently. If we can't operate efficiently, we're not going to operate, because it's as simple as that. We've been burning cash for the last 6 months, 7 months. If we can't start making money, we're going to see more people out of business, and that's the reality. So the real focus and the real challenge across the globe is to how we actually manage what we do next. We've got to keep these support mechanisms going. We've got to support the traffic. If you're putting a constraint in, and a constraint could be operational, commercial, or any other aspect, it's got to be done on a justifiable basis. You know, we need to measure that, because potentially anything you do here on in, as we look towards the recovery, could potentially impact the viability of operations in that airspace, that airport, that TMA, whichever. So it's really important that we focus on supporting air travel. You know, it's the number one thing. We need to make it as efficient and as optimized as possible. Doesn't always mean shortest point, but it does mean we need to make the most efficient system we possibly can. And I really see that as the challenge in the next 6 to 9 months. We talk about point-to-point destinations, but every time we operate to an airport, we need alternates as well. And we've got a swathe of aircraft parked all around the world, from airlines that have gone bust, or aircraft that are parked because airlines are not operating them. So we need to make sure that core capacity is available in the system. Otherwise, the system is potentially going to die.
And I think you're quite right. And without singling out particular governments, I mean, that message was coming out as early as April from ICAO and IATA, you know, which are both international bodies, and yet many governments didn't seem to pick up on the importance until now, when airlines are packing up. And as you say, that some of those ANS providers are running out of cash. And so how do we get governments to actually listen? I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges, isn't it, as we do go forward?
Yeah, I think one of the point that was Geoff was referring to, in order to get it running and up, is to eliminate the element of fear that people want to travel. It plays a big role, especially people going on leave. Want to come back, has that quarantine thing, for example, whether at destination or coming back home. The element of fear of going somewhere and not be able to have the health coverage, for example. All those plays a big roles in the humanity.
Yeah, it's perception. There's a lot of negative perception out there, and you know, okay, we're in the industry. I'll travel tomorrow if I could safely. It's the unknown of being able to get back. Not that I'm worried about at this end, but I'm worried about the constraints in other places. You know, and we really need to focus on supporting those networks. We've seen a lot of news in the last week about this vaccine. But to make the vaccine acceptable, one, it's got to be delivered, but secondly, countries have got to be able to accept that into their regime. It's too simplistic just to be shutting borders or quarantining people for 14 days, irrespective. How are we going to actually accommodate that and bring that into the overall mechanism? It doesn't mean one thing is going to work. It could be a whole swathe of things to encourage people back to traveling. We tried, you know, on all of our flights, masks are compulsory, the social distancing, how we manage the end-to-end solution. But unless the governments are supporting this as well, you know, we are going to be fighting it, and it's got to be unified. It can't be one rule there and one rule over there.
And I think there's also another elephant in the room that that happens with our industry. And I had an example. My 7-year-old grandson came in the other day and said, you know, Granddad, why do you fly an aeroplane? You know, you're ruining the world. You're pumping out all that smoke. That's a message getting through to kids. As an industry, you know, we've got to be aware that there is an environmental challenge. And I think as air navigation providers, we've got to be aware that actually that's part of the problem, not part of the solution at the moment with the way we route, particularly in Europe, I know. So we've got to, you know, there's a lot of messages we've got to get out as an industry that we found miserably to do, and always try and pass it on. You know, let's blame the airlines, let's blame the airports, let's blame the air navigation guys. We've got to recognize environment is another challenge to stop people flying.
Yep, I think you're right. I think, you know, I mean, we're fortunate with Emirates. We've got a very young fleet, fuel efficient for the size of the aircraft. We want to work with the ANSPs to make sure that we are creating flight paths that are as efficient as possible. It's not just about emissions, it's also about noise. We recognize that. We've got a high technical capability. We want to be able to utilize that. You know, one of the things we've been talking about in the industry for a long time is best equipped, best served. You know, there's times of the day in some airspaces where you may be limiting the users to just those that have the capability that actually can use those enhanced procedures or reduce separations, you know, the enhanced track keeping, whatever it might be. That's okay, as long as it's done in a managed way. But I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. We've had these environmental targets that we've been touting as an industry. We need to deliver on those as well, and now more than ever, because we need to gain the confidence of the public back again to air travel.
So do you think the pandemic then, Mike, I want to come to you on this one then, has caused the need to change how we prioritize future developments or enhancements?
Yeah, I think we alluded to it a little earlier with the priorities. They're going to be shorter term and they're going to be longer term priorities. For example, if we just touch on ICAO's ASBUs, the ASBU blocks. Those those have got year on year targets or set dates that you should be aiming at. But you know, COVID having been here with us as long as it has, those are going to need to be reviewed, for example. I think if our experience now during COVID-19, one of the things that we were extremely grateful for was that in all of our units in Maktoum and in DXB, is we have very robust contingency facilities, and we've utilized those to a large extent during this pandemic. And I think ANSPs that don't have a very robust contingency facilities might be looking to prioritize that in the shorter term, because that was a huge benefit to us.
So you talk about things like remote towers and stuff like that. I mean, they're great contingencies, aren't they? I mean, do you see that taking off a lot more now?
Absolutely, I can see that that might be a set of technology that will be be fast tracked throughout ANSPs worldwide, moving it from more smaller airports, medium-sized airports now to much larger airports, because it definitely is mitigation for a second pandemic.
Do you agree with that, Mohamed? Do you think that's the way we should be going to get resilience in our industry?
I actually do. Got a good approach out of it. Totally agree with Mike as well. The level of acceptance, the level of acceptance of change moving forward, that has to be there as well. You might face some people that actually they stop at change and they cannot move forward. That's gonna have a big impact. But the level of acceptance to change has to be there in all stakeholders and partners.
So let me ask you then, how do you think then we're going to shape the future of air traffic control? Where are we going?
Basically, it's really a tough call on this one. As for example, in the time being, I would say the focus now is more of sustainability, funding. There has been, for example, some projects that's been carried on and was supposed to be working on, for example, this year, next year, and so on. Now it has postponed for future phases, or some organization might have eliminated those projects in order to keep sustainability within the organization, keep the flow of funding ongoing, and also. People are looking into new approaches in order to maintain the demand versus the capacity. A reduced number of sectors, for example, make collaboration and the need of align our future investment are more important than ever. As Geoff highlighted before, the sharing of information between airports, NSPs, and other stakeholders is the best way currently in order to maintain the air traffic management and maintain the dynamic approaches between ANSPs and airline. We also need to use the opportunity to test and implement solutions that we have that will make air traffic management more resilient to disruption, building in flexibility, shift capacity in line with the demand, rather than managing the demand to fit the available capacity. Air traffic movement has actually reduced tremendously, and the capacity of controllers exceeds the traffic movement. Big number of organizations around the world has stopped training, for example, air traffic control. But there are other organizations that came up with the new approaches, the other way of training, remote training. monitoring by screen and working, for example, on clouds, which I've dealt with one of those organizations before. For example, the FAA has also amended the work, the way they do work. Temporarily, they adjusted the operating hours for, I think, approximately 100 control towers nationwide. The UAE approaches was also combining sectors, altering the shift rotations in order to maintain the air traffic flow ongoing. Also in regard the air traffic control and facing future situations that we might be faced with, and hopefully not in any other pandemics. And for example, we maintain the air traffic control competency and annual competency, or their certification. The way that's been carried has to be done differently. For example, in order to maintain the social distancing or whatever that we might face in the future. So the way that it's been approached now has to actually look at it differently.
Okay. And Mike, just in a sort of Dubai point, I mean, we see Dubai as one of the global leaders really on a move towards urban air mobility. We've been talking about air taxis in the Emirates for some years. We've talked about delivery drones beginning to operate. We've talked about jetman flights and so on. There's a lot of interesting airspace challenges going on there. How do you see that future of air traffic control incorporating all of that while also maintaining the ability for Geoff's airline and others to be coming into the busiest airport in the world?
Yeah, it is a really, really big challenge, but it gets better all the time. You know, it was very disruptive some years ago. You know, the procedures we had in place were very stringent, and we ended up shutting down the airspace. Geoff will remember that's one of the hugs and kisses things, where you know, the airspace was shut down for as long as 40 minutes at a time. So we made a lot of progress. Dubai is a forward-thinking city. You know, it puts a lot of emphasis on innovation. So if there is going to be any kind of innovation with regards to air taxis and those sorts of things, you're going to find them here. We need to work very closely with our regulators, which we have been doing. We recently developed a safety case allowing UAS operations within closer proximity to the airport than we would have before. And this included our airspace designers, which has taken a real load off us as ANSP, and a service provider. But yeah, we did say earlier that there will probably now, with what's transpired during this pandemic, be a greater emphasis worldwide of integrating UAS and UTM.
Great. And Geoff, final word with you. How do you see the future shaping for air traffic control?
Well, I think there's sort of there's a near and a longer. The first one, I think, very clearly, and it's a word that's been used a lot recently, we need to promote survival. We need to promote survival of the industry. You talked about some other aspects about the environmental emissions going forward. We need to promote survival of the industry. I do see change coming. We need to focus on, there's a couple of really important points raised there. Resilience is really important. This is, if this hasn't demonstrated the need for resilience, nothing will. But efficiency, managed by exception. Why are we doing it? And value add. It's got to be back for, we're doing something for a reason. Why are we doing that? Why are we doing that change? Are we doing it to promote a benefit to the industry? Are we doing it to ensure we've got resilience? Are we doing it just because, you know, and Mike mentioned before the ASBOs and the Global Air Navigation Plan. Are we doing it simply because it was in there? You know, there's got to be a reason. We have to go back and look at all those and say, right, and I do agree, there's a near term, but the medium long term, why are we doing that change? What's the benefit going to be back to the industry that ensures that we can ensure our own survival as an industry? And it's as simple as that, I think.
Geoff, thank you very much. We're running out of time, but I think it's fair to say that we actually met the aim that we were asked to do, which was to look at embracing change, reassessing the way we do things, and recovery and resilience as a result of that pandemic. I feel a lot more inspired that we're going to do it. We're going to get through it, and this industry is going to be stronger than ever it was before. So Mike, Geoff and Mohamed, thank you very, very much for participating today.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.